listeners, gather close. This is Mr. Horror Global. Tonight's story comes from a man I'll call Daniel. So tired of people, he rented a house at the foot of a mountain with no one for miles and a field out front he should never have looked at. Viewer discretion advised. The Scarecrow. Some people don't just get tired of other people. They get tired all the way down, until the sound of a neighbor's car or a stranger's laugh feels like sandpaper dragged across the inside of the skull. I once heard a story about a man like that. I'll call him Daniel. He got so sick of people that he packed up his whole life in the city and went looking for somewhere with no one in it. And he found it. That was the problem. The place he rented was an old two-story house, white plaster walls set well outside the village, past the last cluster of homes, right up against the foot of a mountain. There wasn't another house in sight. It was quiet in a way the city never is, the kind of quiet that has a weight to it. And directly in front of the house, just past the yard, there was a field, a big one. Nobody had worked it in years, by the look of it. The weeds had grown waist-high and gone to seed, and the whole expanse of it gave off a strange, cool stillness, even in the afternoon. But Daniel wasn't planning to stay long. A few months, clear his head, so he didn't think much about the field. He unpacked his boxes and let the silence settle over him like he'd wanted. The first wrongness came the very next day, late in the afternoon. He'd been at his desk, working, and he stood to stretch a stiff neck and happened to glance out through the living room window. The sun had already dropped behind the ridge, throwing long red shadows across the field, turning the weeds dark. And out there, right in the middle of all that overgrowth, something was standing. He narrowed his eyes. It was a scarecrow. But not the friendly kind, not the straw hat and the painted smile you picture. This thing was dressed in a woman's dress, old and torn and caked in dust, hanging off the frame, and the worst part was the shape of it. The head, the part that should have sat upright on the post, was bent hard over to the right, cranked at an angle no neck should make, so that it seemed to be staring straight down into the dirt at its own feet. It was made to look like a person. Too much like a person. Looking at it, a cold line traced its way up his spine. His first thought was that somebody had built it that way on purpose, to be unsettling, some local with a mean streak, or a prank. He told himself it was nothing, country people and their odd ways, and he reached over and pulled the blinds shut, hard. The next morning he made his coffee and went to crack the blinds for some air, and he froze where he stood. The scarecrow had moved. The evening before, it had stood dead center in the field. Now it was no longer in the center. It had come along the furrows, several yards closer, and it was angled toward his front door, not toward the field, not toward the road, toward his house. Head still wrenched over to the right, still staring at the ground. There had been no wind in the night, and the thing wasn't some lightweight bundle of straw an animal could knock over and drag. It was a heavy wooden post sunk into the dirt. Someone, he thought, had pulled that post up out of the ground and carried it closer and planted it again, aimed at his door. There was no other explanation he could stand to think. He couldn't sit with it. Around midday he walked into the village, to the little shop at the edge of it, and there on a bench out front sat the old man who ran the place, the village elder, the one everybody deferred to. Daniel sat down and, careful, casual, asked him about the scarecrow in the field by his house. Was it the local kids messing around? Was the owner of the field moving it for some reason? He barely got the question out. The can of drink in the old man's hand dropped to the ground and went rolling. The color just drained out of his face, went white all at once, like something had been pulled out of him. His eyes went wide, his jaw started to tremble, and he didn't even look at the can rolling away at his feet. He grabbed Daniel by the wrist, gripped it so hard the bones ground together, and he started looking around, fast, in every direction, like he was afraid of being overheard. And he said, in a voice that was already coming apart, "From tonight, when the sun goes down, whatever happens, whatever you hear, do not look at the window that faces that field. Do not go near it. Lock every door, lock every window, and don't you go near the glass." It wasn't advice. It was the kind of thing a man says when he's watched it happen to someone before. And before Daniel could even ask him why, "What is it? What are you talking about?" the old man tore his hand loose and got up and hurried away, half running, like he couldn't get clear of Daniel fast enough. That walk back to the house was a long one. By the time he got there, it was already past 6, and out in the country the sun goes down fast, frighteningly fast. The living room had been orange a minute ago, and then it was just gone, swallowed into black, and the temperature in the house seemed to drop with it. He went around turning on every light in the place. Then he found himself standing at the living room window with the cord of the blinds in his hand. The old man's warning was ringing in his head. Don't go near the glass, but he couldn't stand not knowing. He had to see where it was. He had to see the field. He told himself he'd go crazy otherwise, so he held his breath and parted the slats with 2 fingers and looked out. It was pitch black out there. He couldn't see a thing. And then he heard it. Just beyond the glass, something heavy and solid was coming across the dirt. Footsteps, if you could call them that. Not the rhythm of a person walking, something stiff and weighted, dragging itself through the wet earth, plowing through the furrows of the field, getting closer. The sound went into him like cold water. He clapped both hands over his own mouth and nose, terrified that even his breathing would carry. A wind came down off the mountain then, a wind cold enough to ache in the teeth. And the dragging thing came up out of the soft field and onto the cement of the yard. He heard the change in the sound under it. It came right up to the front of the living room window, and it didn't stop there. It moved across the yard to the front door. Then it drifted, slow, around to the bedroom window, circling, testing, like an animal walking the walls of a place, looking for the one gap it can get through. And while it circled, the cold in the house deepened, and a smell started coming in, through the seam under the door, through the frames of the windows, a sour, stale smell of turned earth, of dirt and rot, snaking into the rooms. When it hit the back of his throat, his stomach rolled over, and every hair on his body stood up. I don't know how long it went on, but eventually the dragging, rustling sound came around to the front of the big living room window, and stopped, dead. He knew what he was supposed to do. He was supposed to get to the back bedroom and lock the door and stay there. The old man's voice was going off in his head like a fire bell, but the fear had its hand around his throat, and not knowing what was on the other side of that glass was somehow worse than anything he could imagine seeing. He felt like his heart would burst if he didn't look. So he got down on the floor, flat, and crawled, slow, on his belly toward the window. It was maybe 3 feet. It felt like miles. He reached the wall under the window and put up one shaking hand and pinched the very bottom of the blinds and gently, gently parted them. A thin gap of moonlight came through a break in the clouds and fell across the glass, and what he saw stopped the breath in his chest. He couldn't even scream. His voice was just gone. Not a hand's width from the glass, pressed up close, was the Scarecrow from the field. The old dress, the dust. Except it wasn't a scarecrow. It wasn't straw stuffed into a sack and shaped like a person. It was a person, an emaciated, dried-out woman, real, behind the cloth. There was a wooden post bound up against her back, and her arms had been forced out along a wooden crossbar and lashed there, hanging, and her neck was the worst of it. A thick rope was knotted around her throat, and her head was bent over at that broken, impossible angle, cranked down to the right, and because of that angle, through the tangle of hair hanging across her face, two clouded, black eyes were looking up at him sideways, right at him, through the glass. Then the end of the wooden crossbar, the wood her arms were tied to, began to tap against the window. Tap, tap, the dry rasp of bark scraping glass, and in that dead, total silence it went through his eardrums like a blade. She pressed her face flat to the window, mouth dropping open, and started breathing, hauling in long, ragged breaths. The glass fogged with the breath, and every time she gasped, wet black dirt spilled out from between her bared gums and pattered down. The wood was striking the glass harder now, like she meant to break through. He heard the glass begin to craze, a fine line of a crack, and through it all, those broken-necked black eyes never once left him. He was certain the glass was about to shatter, certain the thing was about to come in, and then, right at the edge of it breaking, the pounding just stopped, cut off, like it had never happened. He stayed there, flat on the floor under the window, not lifting his head, not once, until the sun finally came up and put light back on the floor of the living room. His whole body had locked rigid. He couldn't move a finger. His jaw shook on its own, out of his control, after a whole night of that. Around 7, when the light got into his eyes, the one animal instinct left in him, the instinct to live, got him up off the floor. He wasn't thinking about packing. He wasn't thinking about anything. He snatched his car keys off the table, threw the front door open, and bolted across the yard. And as he ran for the car, he couldn't help it. He looked at the living room window. There was nothing there. The scarecrow stood out in the middle of the field again, exactly where it had first been, head bent, perfectly still. He didn't look twice. He got in, jammed the pedal down, and tore out of there. The road off the mountain wound down through the trees, and as he hit it, a fog came up, thick, unnatural, so dense it pressed against the windshield like a wall. He couldn't see more than a few yards. He didn't slow down. He cranked the wheel through the dirt road switchbacks with one thought in his head: get off this mountain. And then, going hard through the fog, he saw something past the passenger window, a dark shape, person-shaped, there and gone in the white. He flinched onto the brake but couldn't make himself stop, and he hit the gas again. A little farther on, the same shape slid past the driver's side. And then he understood what he was seeing, and the breath went out of him. They were lining the road, both sides, spaced out at even intervals, standing in the fog like mile markers, and they weren't people. They were the Scarecrow, the same one, over and over, the old woman's dress, the body bound to the wooden post, dozens of them, all down both shoulders of the road, and every single one had its head cranked over to the same side, and every one of those cross-shaped wooden arms was pointing the same way, back toward the house he'd just run from. It wasn't a road out. It was a road being closed. Something was telling him to go home. He swallowed the scream and threw the wheel over and drove. The navigation screen had gone to nothing but a red light blinking that he was off the route. He drove through that fog for what felt like hours, on, and then, finally, the fog thinned and broke, and the world came back, and he stamped both feet on the brake and stopped the car. He was not on the road to the city. He was in the front yard of the old house, the same house he'd fled 30 minutes before. He had driven the other way the whole time, and the mountain had simply handed him back to where he started. And then he looked up through the windshield, and his heart nearly stopped. The scarecrow that had been standing out in the field when he ran, it wasn't in the field anymore. It had come all the way up and planted itself directly in front of the house, square in front of the door, its broken neck leaning against the wood, blocking the way in, as if to say, "You don't even get to go back inside." The car went silent. His palms were soaked through, slick on the wheel, and the car, that little sealed box, started to feel less like shelter and more like a trap. That was when the rearview mirror drifted into the corner of his eye. In the mirror, the back seat that should have been empty. Dead center, someone was sitting there, head bowed low, the old torn dress. He had no idea how long it had been in the car with him, riding behind him through the fog. Something in his mind just snapped clean. He threw his whole body against the locked door and burst it open and fell out onto the ground. He tore his knees open on a rock in the dirt and didn't feel it. He scrambled up and ran straight at the thing blocking his own front door, because being inside that cursed house, even that, was better than spending one more second in the car with the thing in the back seat. That was the only choice left to him, and it wasn't really a choice, it was instinct. He hit the scarecrow with his shoulder, shoved past it, and got inside, and then he locked everything. The deadbolt, the chain. He dragged the umbrella stand from beside the shoe rack and wedged it against the door. And then he slid down with his back against it and sat there on the floor, heaving like an animal, looking around the dead quiet house. His phone said no service. Out of the coverage area, that cold little message and nothing else. The car was finished. The road just spit him back here, and now there was no way to call anyone. He'd lost every exit. He was sealed inside that house, as completely as if it had been built around him. Blocking the door wasn't enough to calm him. On shaking legs, he crawled to the kitchen and found the biggest, sharpest knife in there. His hand on the handle had gone white, no blood in it, and he knew, better than anyone he knew, that a piece of steel wasn't going to stop the thing outside. He took it anyway. He folded himself into a corner of the living room and sat there, the knife out, watching the windows and the doors, one to the next, and the only sound left in the whole house was his own heart slamming. The light on the floor went red, that ugly blood red of late sun stretching long across the boards, and he had to sit with his eyes open and watch the dark eat it, inch by inch, until it was gone. When full night came, he turned off every light he turned on, and he hid in the dark, and some instinct, some terrible pull, drew him slowly back toward that living room window. He couldn't make himself lift the blinds. He just pushed one slat down with a fingertip and looked out into the yard. The day before, there had been one scarecrow in that field.
There wasn't one anymore.
Out in the dark, they stood in the same torn woman's dress, bound to the same crosses of wood, and there was no end to them. Dozens. They had ringed the house, a full circle around it, spaced out and ordered like soldiers who'd been drilled to it, and every one of those dozens of heads was turned, without a single one out of line, toward the window he was hiding behind. There was no wind that night, not a breath, but the cold weight coming off them, the pressure of all that attention, came right through the glass and started, slowly, to close around his throat. He couldn't even cry out. He backed away and fled into the smallest room at the very heart of the house, shut the door, dropped into the corner and jammed his hands over his ears. And under him, under the floor where he was crouched, under the thick flooring, something started. Not the small dry scrabble of an insect, something raking at packed earth, hard, digging up toward him. The sound moved the whole floor in a fine vibration, and it was coming, slow, dragging itself toward the corner where he sat. He felt it through the soles of his feet, and when he looked up, looking up was worse. Fine, sour dust was sifting down from the corners of the ceiling and the seams in the wallpaper, pouring in a thin, steady stream like sand through an hourglass, fouling the air of that little room. Dirt coming down from above him, something digging up from below to pull him under, and he understood what the house actually was. It had stopped being a place anyone lived in. It was a box built to bury him alive, a coffin with rooms. And then, like a switch thrown, it all went silent. Everything held its breath, a wrong, unnatural stillness pressed down on the house. He sat there with his knees pulled to his chest, jammed into the corner, straining at the shut door and the silence past it. He had no intention of going out, but the quiet was somehow worse than the noise, squeezing harder on whatever was left of his nerve. And right then, the old fluorescent tube on the ceiling, the one that had been flickering, popped with a sick little crack and went out, and the dark came down so complete he couldn't see his own hand. With his eyes useless, everything else woke up. The cold of the air on his skin, the dirt smell, the faint trembling under him, all of it screaming. The only thing he could do in that blackness was shut his eyes tight and clamp his hands over his ears. And in that instant, a blast tore through the house, an explosion of sound, glass shattering, the whole living room coming apart, followed by a roar like a landslide, tons of earth pouring in over the floor, wave after wave of it, a waterfall of dirt filling the room beyond his door. He couldn't even scream. He crawled backward across the floor to the farthest wall. The living room wasn't a room anymore, and in the muck of it, something began to move. A heavy, wrong shape, flattened against the mud-covered floor, dragging itself on all fours. The window had blown in, and the earth had come in with it, and so had they, the dozens of figures that had ringed the field. And one of them, or maybe the first one, the original, was coming across the floor like an animal, like some enormous insect, on its belly, and every time it pulled itself forward, that grotesquely bent neck joint twisted and wrenched, and the sound of the bone grinding in it filled the whole black house. The dragging, scraping sound came closer and closer, and then, right outside the door of the room where he hid, it stopped. One thin door between him and it, and through the narrow gap at the bottom of that door came a sound, something with its windpipe half blocked, breathing in cold, wet, sucking gasps, right there, inches away. He couldn't stay on that floor. To live, he had to get out of sight. There was a big built-in wardrobe in the corner of the room, and he threw himself at it, hauled the doors open with both shaking hands, tore through the heavy folded blankets, stacked inside like an animal digging, and crammed his whole body into the cramped black space, and pulled the door shut and held it from the inside. The inside of that wardrobe was perfect, lightless dark. Old cloth and mothballs in a space barely big enough to fold himself into. He had his hands over his mouth. His heartbeat was so loud he thought it would split his eardrums, but he forced his breathing down to nothing, desperate not to let one sound escape. And then, beyond the wardrobe door, he heard the door of the room itself burst apart, the wood shattering, the sound ringing through the room, and after it, Something heavy collapsed in across the floor with a thick, wet sound, the twisting bone crack of that bent neck, and the thing in the Scarecrow's skin was all the way inside the room with him. His heart felt like it stopped. And then, inside the wardrobe, the impossible started. At the very bottom where he was crouched, something cold and wet began to touch his ankles, his back. The wooden floor of the wardrobe, which had been dry and solid, had turned somehow into sucking mud, soft as a flooded marsh, giving way under him. The air inside filled in an instant with a foul, rotting stench, and his body began slowly to sink into the mire. Every rational part of him was clawing to get out, but in that crushed little box there was no room even to stand. And then out of the cold pit of mud at the bottom of the wardrobe, two thick, gaunt hands shot up and seized him by both ankles, like an animal taking prey. It wasn't a human grip. It was a force that felt like it would shatter the bones in his ankles, and it began, without mercy, to drag him down into the bottomless mud beneath. He kicked the wardrobe door, raked his fingernails down the walls until they tore, and it did nothing. The mud climbed from his ankles past his waist to his chest, heavy, fast, the whole thing swallowing him like a great bog. When it reached his chin, in that absolute dark, something cold and hard pressed up against his face. It was the grotesquely bent head of the woman, meeting his face in the mud. He couldn't see it. He felt it perfectly, right in front of him, her jaw cracked open wide, and from between those gaping gums, black earth came pouring out. He couldn't breathe, and the moment he opened his mouth to try, cold, rotted mud rammed down where the air should have gone. Dirt forced up his nose and down his throat, packing his airway solid, and the pain of it went through his whole body. And just before the dark took him for good, the last thing he felt, the very last sensation, was hands, cold, rough hands, taking hold of him as he thrashed there buried and stripping the clothes off his body. Then a stiff, rough length of wood pressed hard against his back. Someone wound a coarse rope around his arms and wrenched them out along a crossbar and bound them there. And last of all, hands took his head and twisted it over toward his right shoulder until it cracked and tied it fast against the post. That cold touch, that obscene little ceremony of dressing a new offering to take the old one's place, that was the last of it, before he was pulled down into the perfect dark of death. A few days later, the old house at the foot of the mountain stood empty, its tenant gone. Inside, behind locked doors, there was not a handful of mud, not a sliver of broken glass, just a clean, peaceful, terrible quiet. But out front, when the sun went down and the red dusk lay heavy over everything, in the middle of that wide field full of weeds, there stood a new Scarecrow, swaying a little in the cold wind off the mountain. And the new Scarecrow was wearing, down to the last stitch, the clothes of the man who had moved out from the city only days before, bound tight to its cross of wood. Its head was cranked hard over to the right, staring down into the dirt at its feet. And as the wind died and the dark came down over the field, the empty eyes in that bent-over head turned, just slightly, just enough, toward the window of the empty house. Because that's how a place like that keeps itself. It doesn't kill you to be rid of you. It kills you to put you in its place, to bind you to the post and turn your head to the ground and leave you standing in the field. And then it waits, patient as dirt, for the next person who's tired enough of people to come looking for somewhere with no one in it.